Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeremy Goldberg. I'm the president and quarterback at LeagueApps. We're going to let everyone join in on the Zoom and get started momentarily. But we're excited to have you with us for what's going to be an awesome discussion around lacrosse and what's in store for youth and local lacrosse in the wake of this COVID crisis, with some of the amazing voices and experts in the world of youth lacrosse. You know, we've been doing these events now for over 8 weeks and all kinds of different conversations. And what we really wanted to do today is a little bit different, which is to really hone in on a specific sport and look in at how that specific sport is approaching, navigating with so much uncertainty about what youth sports would look like. And what we found in these conversations is that if we can use the wisdom of this community, because no one has the answers, we can ultimately come up with the best ideas of how to think about how to return to play and ultimately to survive this crisis, and more importantly, thrive that. I've been struck by the resiliency of people within the youth sports community and how innovative and focused they are in making sure their organizations gets through this. And what it reminds us of is the power of sports, right? The idea that in its absence, we appreciate it even more. And sports matters so much more than what happens on the field, right? It has the ability to impact communities. It changes lives. It produces leaders like we'll hear from today. And I think that's what this is about, is that this is much more than just what happens on a field. And that is why youth sports is going to come back. That's why it needs to come back. And that's ultimately why we wanted to have this conversation today. A few kind of housekeeping items as we jump in. The first thing I'll mention is, as many of you know, we've helped launch the Play Sports Coalition. Over 3,000 organizations have joined together to kind of advocate in Washington to make sure that this industry is looked after. When they talk about all the other industries and how they've been impacted by this crisis, for sure, the youth sports organization and youth sports industry and sector has been impacted as any of them. One of the things that we've seen, and there's some new data that came out this morning, is that over 46% of organizations are saying that they're in danger of shuttering. And that has two implications. One is we got to make sure that those organizations survive and that they have the assistance that they need, and make sure that parents are able to come back and invest in youth sports again. And that's one of the reasons why the Play Sports Coalition exists. So we'll share that link in the chat tool. And if you're interested, go ahead and learn how your organization can get involved in that, enjoying that efforts. But the second thing is what that data tells me is that not every organization is going to make it. And it's the organizations that are really thinking most innovatively, that are thinking different, that are listening to their parents, that are listening to their community. They're the ones that are going to figure out how to survive and thrive. There's a Harvard business case study that was that I refound that I'll have also posted in the chat tool that looked at all companies and organizations, for-profits and nonprofits, that survive these kinds of crises. Obviously, this is pretty unprecedented, but an economic crisis. And what we found when you look at that data is that about 9% of organizations figure out how to go through a period of disruption like we have now and actually not only survive, but thrive. That if you look a few years after those incidents, they've experienced incredible growth and success. And there's a lot of organizations that don't make it. And then a majority of organizations kind of muddle through. And so the question is how do you become one of those 9%? As a for-profit or nonprofit, how are you adapting what you're doing? And what they found at the heart of that article is a mixture of offense and defense, right? Is the idea that how do you find more efficiency in what you do, control your costs as you need to, but not stopping the focus on innovation, on R&D, on marketing, on building relationships. And if you find that balance, you'll ultimately be successful. And I'm excited to get into that conversation today. What is the mixture of offense and defense that these incredible organizations are playing? We want to make this an interactive discussion, so I'll encourage everybody to go into the Q&A tab within the Zoom module. So if you have a question, go ahead and post it there. We've got a bunch of questions that were shared in advance, but if you share it there, it allows other people to upvote that, so I know the kinds of topics that you want to hear from when it comes to this panel. And as we jump in, I want to give a shout out to Paul Rachael, who happens to be an investor of ours and a friend, and we'll hear from Rachael and all about the great stuff that the PLL is doing. It's the first professional league that has really announced here in this country that they're coming back. But Paul introduced me to a mentor of his and someone he really looks up to, a guy named Scott Galloway. And there's actually a great podcast that you can find when Paul's podcast for Suiting Up, where he talked about Scott Galloway. And what Scott Galloway is really interesting is that Scott looked at Amazon, he looked at Facebook, he looked at Apple, and he looked at Google. And he wrote a book called The Four, right? The hidden DNA of those four companies. And he had two great quotes that I think about at this moment that I think can really shape the conversation today. The first is, it seems impossible until it isn't, right? It seems impossible until it isn't. And ultimately, I think we're facing what seems like an impossible situation as you navigate it. And it will feel that way until ultimately you figure out your way through. And the second thing is in looking at those businesses and looking at those organizations, he talked about that change is a daily constant. He was almost anticipating the moment right now, because he was describing that you're ultimately going to have to master tools that didn't even exist a year ago, that all of a sudden you're expected to master. So whether that's Zoom or whether that's the way you're thinking about your programming, the idea of change being a constant is a feature of where we're at now. And so we hope we can help you navigate those changes here at LeagueApps. So with that, I'm excited to jump into our incredible panel. And we've got perspectives not only across boys and girls lacrosse, not only representing geographic diversity, but people who also represent different kinds of programs that exist. First we have Theresa Sherry. She's the CEO of the Tenacity project. I'm excited to learn from her more about that program out in the Bay Area. And she also is incredibly accomplished. She's actually teammates with Rachael back at Princeton, where they won 2 national championships. I believe there's a rebroadcast that's coming up that we'll hear a little bit about. And so an incredibly accomplished player in her own right, and an incredible leader at Tenacity. We've got Rachael, who's joining us from the PLL Academy. She came to that from the WPLL, and she also brings experience outside of youth sports in the healthcare world and nursing home world. So she brings a perspective and context for what's going on. And she's an incredibly accomplished player, as I mentioned, not only a teammate of Theresa, but also won the effective the Tewarton Road. I'm going to butcher that. Sorry about that. The trophy, the Heisman equivalent, is what I was told in lacrosse, and is one of the most incredibly accomplished players around. So we're excited to have you join us. We've got Jake Deane that's here from True Lacrosse. And True has been an innovative organization that has dominated the Midwest and many other kind of regions in the country and the programs that they run, very much known for their club teams and what they're doing, and always being an organization that's innovative. And he himself is a terrific player as a professional lacrosse player at the MLL. And then last but not least, we've got Steve Cepeta from Adrenaline Lacrosse, and he is based out in the Bay Area, in California, in San Diego. Adrenaline to us has always been a great partner and an amazing organization, not only known for putting on incredible tournaments, but also being really innovative in the way that they think about their organization, whether it's e-commerce or whatnot. And he, again, also is an accomplished player from his time at Notre Dame. So thank you all for being here. And maybe let's start and introduce our audience to your organization. So Theresa, I'll have you kick it off and give us a little bit about the Tenacity project. What is the project? What does your organization do? And maybe give us a sense of how you've been impacted by the current crisis.
The Tenacity Project is a nonprofit organization, and we're really focused on girls and teaching life lessons through sports. I was a multi-sport athlete at Princeton, but right now we're focused on lacrosse and teams specifically. We really feel like young people grow through a team environment in a very impactful way. We have teams, our niche is kind of the non-traditional lacrosse playing areas. So we started up when I was at Cal Berkeley, and once I left Cal, we went into Texas, and we now have, most of our teams are in the San Francisco Bay Area and in Utah. We have some girls in Oregon as well, and a couple from Houston still on our teams. So we primarily run teams, camps, clinics. We do a few events, and a big thing that we do for our families is support them in the college process. Just there kind of is required a little extra college counseling and advocacy, I would say, in the process, just because most college rosters are made up of girls from the Northeast. So that's a big part of what we do. We're really focused on whole person development. I would say that's become one of the primary things that we do through our lacrosse curriculum. So they're developing tools on the field that they can use off the field, and we're trying to constantly make those ties. And in our curriculum, we're very intentional about how we deliver a lot of those different skill building tools.
Yeah, and I'm excited to get into this. One of the things I think about, I feel like right now we're going through the world's biggest brand exercise, which is if I said you had to prove the value of your lacrosse organization, but you couldn't actually play lacrosse, how would your organization be valuable, right? And ultimately, as an organization, if you could answer that question, right, that we're so valuable in the relationships that we have, the experiences that we deliver, the mentoring that we can offer, to the extent that you can articulate that, then all what happens on the field is just a product that you're offering to help you achieve something that's even larger than what happens on the field. And so that, to me, is a really powerful question, that if the only value you can articulate is what happens between the lines, then you're limiting the possible of how you're positioning your organization. And if you figure that out, and it sounds like Tenacity, that was already part of what you were doing, I think that allows you to stay relevant at a time like this. So excited to get into that with you, Theresa. Thank you for being with us. Jake, talk to us a little bit about True and the empire you've built in the Midwest. Give us a little context about your scale and reach and kind of where you operate, and maybe some hint about kind of how you've kind of approached this current pause.
Yeah, well, Jeremy, thanks again for having me on. I really appreciate it, and I hope everybody is safe and doing well out there. So yeah, True was started back in 2008 by with my partner and I, Mike Gable. We were both playing professional lacrosse for the Chicago Machine out in Chicago, obviously, and we just saw a need to really help players from non-traditional lacrosse hotbeds, help them have the opportunity to go on and play at the next level. And it was tough. It's sometimes tough from these non-traditional lacrosse hotbeds because the coaching is pretty scarce, and kids want to play, all right, but they just don't know where to go. And so we hopped on an opportunity to start True, and that was back in 2008. And fast forward to now, we're in 15 different states. Utah, Colorado, Idaho, Florida, Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, Minnesota, Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, Kansas, Ohio, Delaware, and Wisconsin. And we have around 60 full-time employees that work for us, directors or administrators that work for us all around the country. And we're dealing with this thing just like everybody else, taking it day by day, but also trying to forecast and be creative and come up with new ideas to obviously, take care of our families, because we are a training company. That's what, I want to make clear to everybody out there, is that True Lacrosse is a training camp company, and our families and our players come first. And we're trying to get as creative and as we can to make sure that they're still feeling they're getting a great product and getting something from True Lacrosse. So.
Awesome. Thank you, Jake. And I think one thing that'll be interesting to talk about is, as we think about return to play, which one of the things that's challenging and you're going to be on the front lines with is each state is really approaching this very differently. And given all the places that you operate, you're probably getting a perspective of different attitudes. I see this, being in New York City and on the East Coast, you've experienced this very differently than, for example, my family in Texas, where they shut down earlier. The deaths and devastation weren't nearly the level where they were in New York City, and it's affecting how people view kind of the risks of returning. Steve, I'll turn to you. And one thing I was mentioning before to everybody is I'm grateful for my visit out to Adrenaline years ago as we were starting our partnership, both because you introduced me to like the world's greatest socks. I don't even play lacrosse, but I wear lacrosse socks around. So at least that I still got to figure out how to use a stick properly. But you make great product. And you also introduced me to a California burrito with a burrito with French fries, and it's one of the world's greatest inventions. Clearly I've had a lot of those over time, but working on that. But Steve, I'm excited to hear your perspective, especially as a tournament operator. You're uniquely kind of, there's a lot of questions that people look to, I'm sure, about what's happening and how things will respond. So maybe level set with us a little bit about what Adrenaline Lacrosse is, and what your organization's focused on, and how you've been navigating kind of the initial part of this crisis.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. And yes, our California burritos are second to none here in San Diego. Adrenaline is a team apparel and an event company. We were founded in 2001, sort of by accident, out of need. Alex Cade, who played with me at Notre Dame, and I were coaching here, and there really wasn't much for the kids to do after our first spring here in San Diego, so we started a summer league, which evolved into several other things, stores, and then ultimately tournaments and camps and apparel. We sort of have taken some twists and turns over the years, and no longer in the brick and mortar retail business, no longer really in the club business, although we do have our West Coast Stars National Club and for boys, and a couple of regional legacy clubs that either I or Alex started here in San Diego. But we really hang our hat on providing event experiences for our team partners, club partners, and their families in great locations, at great venues, and on the apparel side, a we have a lot of common customers that do uniforms and team apparel with us, spirit wear, sweats, jackets, and socks, and those kinds of things. And it's funny, we got into the sock thing almost by accident, like well before Stance and even Nike was doing Nike Elite. Again, sort of by accident. It was just something we stumbled into. We took a pair of O'Neill socks, the surf company, to a manufacturer, and they made something for us, and we put them on. We're like, wow, these feel really good. And so we started, I think we kind of became known for socks early, and then, there went Nike, Stance, and all these other companies, and blew right past us. But, it's trying times right now. I think, we've certainly tried to remain optimistic. We've tried to be dynamic in our planning. We've taken just about, we've taken every event out of June. I think we moved 8 events out of June now into late July or August, to ideally buy time, for us to get back to some, possibility of playing again. So I think the one thing we've really stressed as leaders here and with our team internally is communication. None of us have the reality is none of us have the answer right now. This is just so unusual that I've always felt strongly that good communication, can get you through just about anything. And I don't think that's ever been more true than right now. We're all, it's become a bit cliche, but we're all in this together, right? And that goes all the way from, the event venues to the referees, to the college coaches, to the tournament organizers, to the club directors, to the families, to the kids. I mean, it's literally like we're all in this together. So how do we navigate this together? And I'm happy to be a part of things, like this panel, because I'm a part of a couple other coalitions, and it's just a lot of like talk and strategizing right now and spitballing while we wait and get prepared. So I don't know. I feel like the more prepared we can be and the more communicative we can be, the better the result will be all the way around. For us, for everybody on this panel and who's called into this. It's we have no choice but to stay optimistic too. So I've been on a few calls with club directors who've been like, man, you sound real positive. It's nice to have a positive conversation. And it's like, I don't really have much choice other than to stay positive right now. So why not? But that's cautious optimism. And, I think, a lot of, I don't know, a lot of hurrying up and wait right now too. Yeah.
So I think, and one of the things is that Muhammad Ali quote, don't count the days, make the days count. And part of it is how are we using this time to plan for return. There's some interesting study. There's some data that we'll post. There was an article today in Morning Consult, which is a kind of a data kind of surveying company about youth sports that we commented on. And we'll post that for everybody to look at. One of the things they talked about how I think it's well over 90% of parents believe that youth sports was absolutely critical in terms of the physical health and the mental health and well-being for their kids. So I don't think that that's changed. And in fact, you can make a case that in the absence of it, those ideas are reinforced. But that doesn't mean that we're going through a big disruption, because that same survey shows that parents are going to return as they feel safer. And so that there's going to be modifications and adjustments that have to happen. So all of us are facing the same circumstances. It's just a question of how we're responding, which is what we can control. A lot of good points you made, Steve. I'm eager to pick up on. A lot of it also comes down to this community, right? Community is the authority. No one has the answer, but we all have the answer if we share that with each other and learn from each other and work where we can together. Rachael, I'll bring you into the conversation. And I think you have a really interesting perspective to bring. One is you've got, from the PLL side, how a professional league is navigating this. And as you see with all the professional leagues, they're really at the forefront of trying to think of how to bring sports back and navigating it. At the same time, you're really focused on how the PLL Academy is functioning and how that operates. So perhaps you can speak a little bit about what the PLL Academy is, how you're approaching, kind of how you were approaching and how you are approaching this current situation.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. So I actually joined the PLL Academy March 2nd, so right before all of this sort of hit. So my first 10 days looked one way and the rest of it has looked very different. Right. The PLL Academy is the education and training arm of the PLL. So we're about, connecting the next generation of athletes with the best players in the world through different various sort of opportunities, clinics, camps. We do players tour, some overnight opportunities. So Obviously, when we kind of look ahead and think about the last quarter and how we've had to shift all of that business, it's really about how can we maintain that connection with these young kids. Obviously, the PLL athletes are the best in the world, so they give kids something to aspire to. They see Paul and they see Schreiber and they say, I want to be those guys someday. So really connecting those kids with our athletes is so important, for a lot of reasons. And certainly now I think, kids are under very sort of unprecedented times in terms of their mental health. They're all sort of schooling from home and missing their friends. And we thought about how can we provide kids something good to look forward to and a way to connect. So we quickly launched our PLL virtual program, which has been great in the first few weeks, and I think has really helped our athletes continue to feel engaged with kids, but as well given kids, something to smile about and a good reason to put a stick in their hand.
That's great. And we'll get into virtual training as well. One of the interesting questions is, what is short-term about that? What is long-term about that? One of the things that we saw in some data that we're going to be releasing moving forward is how virtual training, I think about 50% of youth sports organizations across the country have entertained or launched some kind of virtual programming, and almost another 18% are thinking about doing so. That means about 80% of organizations will have some kind of virtual training component. Now, one of the things about it is there's the short-term considerations, but there's really a long-term question I think we can get into as well, but about what you're learning and what could be part of that. So I want to break this conversation up and for this entire community in a few parts. One is, as an organization, how you're navigating the financial realities of the current situation, right? And how you're thinking about it in terms of revenues and refunds and expenses. And then I want to talk about return to play and spend a lot of energy around that and all the different considerations around guidelines and liability and program adaptation and the way you're thinking about payments and revenue strategies moving forward. So really focus on those two things. I encourage everyone to use that Q&A panel where you can post questions and also see what other people want to hear about by upvoting those, and that'll help us guide the conversation. But I want to start by, Jake, you mentioned you had 60 full-time employees. And there's a lot, a lot of organizations don't obviously carry that kind of footprint, but how are you navigating when it comes to kind of managing your organization at a time where clearly I imagine your revenue has been pretty impacted? So what advice or experience have you had as you try to navigate that with revenue uncertainty, with kind of a large cost structure or commitment, be that facilities, be that full-time staff?
Yeah, no, 100%. Obviously, it's something that can keep you up at night when you have a business like this. And look, I think there's two things that go into that question. Number one, you want to protect the revenue that you have brought in, all right? And then number two, you got to get creative with different ways to bring in revenue right now, okay? And that's something that we try to establish with all of our employees. It's like, hey, this is an interesting time in all of our lives, but hey, everybody here still has a job, and we got to fight to keep our jobs, okay? And in order to do that, okay, we're not only going to ask you to service our customers and our families, but we're going to also challenge you to come up with creative ways to bring in revenue and continue to keep the ship going, okay? And I think every organization out there, the leaders of their organization have to challenge their people to do that, okay? And there's not a day that goes by that we're not thinking of creative ways, from our management team down to our directors of our different states, to be like, hey, let's figure out ways how to come up with something to keep it going. And then you talk about creating protecting the revenue that you've already had come in. I mean, for many travel companies out there, travel team organizations, you're on a recurring revenue stream, okay? And when you're on a recurring revenue stream, that means the money is hitting every month, okay? So I'm sure, like everyone out there, people are asking, hey, hey, how do I, am I going to get a refund for this month? Am I going to get a refund for this month? Well, my idea is to be able to create so much content and so much value for them while we're off the field, so they don't even think about asking for that refund. So that doesn't even come up to their mind, come to their head, because they're enjoying the virtual training that we're doing. They're enjoying the individual lessons that our directors are starting to do and going around the different houses, providing the guidelines of social distancing. And those are things that we are doing to make sure that our families still feel they're getting a value from True Lacrosse, and that they're not even thinking about.
And have you found that that's reduced your refund rate? Like, you're basically, the families have found the ways that you're figuring out ways of supplementing values has allowed you to manage the need to provide a lot of refunds or deal with a lot of cancellations?
Yeah, I think it's done a couple things. I think, that it does, because people are so engaged with what we're doing. They're not even thinking about, hey, I'm going to ask for a refund now. My kid has an opportunity to do 4 different virtual training sessions every day. My kid has an opportunity to listen to different people as far as leadership talks go. My kid has opportunity to listen to college coaches talk, to different professional players talk. I mean, there's a huge value to that. And then, it also makes the parents feel like, hey, you know what? These guys at True Lacrosse, they're trying. Like, I don't want to go take their money back from them. I want to make sure they stay in business. All right. Because, hey, they're doing everything they can to help keep my son or my daughter engaged in lacrosse.
Yeah. So there's I'll post this data. So buried in the Morning Consult article were these 3 data points, which I thought were really interesting, which is 55% of youth sports parents are concerned that their child's youth sports programs could go out of business, right? And over a quarter of them strongly agree with that sentiment. Interestingly enough, 54% of parents said they would be willing to prepay for future seasons to help them get through it. And then 60% would also be able to pay more if they ultimately felt that they were safer experiences. So at the end of the day, I think the question is how you create parents have to feel that there's value, and you have to be able to communicate on that. I know that's something I'll get into with Steve as well. Theresa, bring you into the conversation. How have you navigated this reality as a nonprofit? I don't know if you rely on donations as well, and if those are impacted, but curious, what is the way that you've kind of managed kind of the revenue disruption here, dealing with whether credits or refunds or disputes, or have you managed to avoid a lot of that?
I think 2 things I just want to say are just that goodwill is gold and connection doesn't cost anything. And so this time of year, actually, our organization usually doesn't do much. We're really protective of the youth and high school seasons, and we're big advocates of people playing locally. And we like to complement those seasons. But with the absence of those seasons, we actually ramped up earlier than usual. And what we really focused on was connection. And I think things that maybe parents and families, even the girls themselves, might have taken for granted before, that connection that you have and that relationship that you build, the role models that you're just around on a consistent basis, we just ramped that up, and without being in person, so it wasn't just about the technical, tactical, and physical skills that they were developing. It's really just that emotional connection. And I think, now that parents are at home with their kids all day and there's such a lack of outside world, especially initially, I think that really has proven invaluable, and we're just continuing to try to be just there, and so all of our coaches have stepped up to try to increase their connection. We've even kind of created like little families between age groups in our teams, and lots of like different creative things that a lot of college coaches do in their programs. We're in a different situation as a nonprofit. In the first place, we don't charge our players what it costs us to run each of the teams. So just in adjusting our budget, we just know that we're going to have to provide more scholarships. But that piece about goodwill is gold is just, I think we have to think about the long game here. We immediately came out and said refunds or scholarships will be given, and meant to just be more like scholarships so that the girls would still participate. It's not like refunds here, we don't have anything on the field for you. Go away. It was, we want your girls to do all the virtual training that we're offering and be on these communication distributions so that you're kind of in the mix, and we'll provide scholarships for those things. People who pay the $25 a week for virtual summer league are, so I think that's been huge. In 2017, there were floods after Hurricane Harvey. I don't know if you remember, and we had teams in Houston and a few families lose homes, but a lot of families just were affected in general. So it was a time when we actually have been through this before. We forgave a lot of final installments for families, and in that way, we're also pausing fees right now for further installments. just until we all know what the rest of the year is going to hold. But that year, there were a lot of families that we just put on scholarship for the rest of the year, and we just ramped up our fundraising to cover that gap or made adjustments in other ways. But it does take, like Jake was kind of referring to, it takes some creativity and some innovation. I think the uncertainty and the belief at times that we're being made to feel in like a return to a tournament season kind of makes it, I think it has paralyzed a lot of companies from what I've seen, and they haven't pivoted. And I think there is some amount of consistency that you want to create, but every business, in my opinion, should be pivoting in some way right now.
Yeah, that Harvard Business Review article I referenced earlier, they talked about why do companies fail. Some is because all they do is play defense. They're paralyzed, they reduce their expenses, and they just don't do anything because they don't know what to do. And then others play offense where they just ignore it and just basically like, we're going to keep on doing what we're going to doing, full steam ahead without adapting to the reality. And it's the organizations that figure out the right mixture of what is the things that you need to continue to do, but really what do you need to adapt. That offense defense is really where you find success. Steve, to pull you into the conversation, one of the key challenges I think a lot of organizations are facing is around how they're dealing with those difficult conversations with either parents, in your case it may be club organizers, around refunds, around the expenses that you may have already incurred and how you have those things, or also the fact that you mentioned that you have uncertainty. So how do you communicate with that kind of uncertainty where people are trying to set their own schedules and they're dependent on what you're doing? So what is the advice you have, or what have you learned about the communication that's necessary, and how has that worked for you?
Sure. It's certainly not easy. But we took the approach of coming up pretty early. I mean, California was pretty early to shut down. So, I mean, we were, I think, on this, pretty early from all right, let's figure out what we can move back to again by time. And when we started to secure new dates, later dates at certain venues, we then mostly communicated those save the dates to programs, giving them an opportunity to see that, okay, if in fact it is canceled from the June date, this is when it will be in August. That allowed us to gather feedback. Sometimes we learn that, well, that save the date or that backup date doesn't work for these reasons. So I think we used that as a good feedback opportunity. At first, it startled people, but I think we just started to get into a rhythm where we were kind of putting out almost weekly new save the dates. And then as we got closer to June, I would say a few weeks ago, we started to then sort of officially start to change. Maybe it was like 2 weeks after we put the save the date out, officially say, all right, it's not happening in June. It's officially happening now in August. And now they're all moved officially out of June. But the refund conversations, are challenging. I think, we're committed to giving everybody, all the clubs, credit for a future event, 100% credit for a future event. There's obviously one-off cases and situations, and we're communicating, having some of those. And, I would say there's an exception to every rule, and there always should be. But I think mostly, again, to my point about us being on this together, I think, our club partners mostly want to see Adrenaline come through this thing successfully and continue to run great events. And, that gets really hard to do if we have to downsize and furlough, and which we haven't and we're not going to do. But, it makes it really hard. And in our world, at least on the event side, I don't think, although it's fun, running virtual tournaments just isn't something people are, gonna pay money for. I saw Syracuse, I think, boys and girls won whatever that was, the U.S. Lacrosse virtual NCAA tournament, right? But that's something we've talked about for fun, but it's just not gonna be real value that we could feel good about charging for. So I'd say again, it's a lot of conversations on that front. I think about pivoting. I mean, on our apparel side, we started making the masks, protective masks, custom. It wasn't something, initially we were sort of like, we don't want to come off as like opportunistic, but then, we started people were coming to us like, can you guys make these? And they were like non-lacrosse friends initially, some friends that run businesses and things that were starting to think about either they were essential and already and working and needing to protect their folks, or starting to think about bringing their people back to work and how they're going to do that safely, and they have to get masks somewhere. And and so we were able to kind of work with our factory and figure out how to do that. And and at some point, as you start to think about it, like teams are going to need it, and it's going to become an accessory for a while, I think, right? And why not wear one that represents your team and your program the way you would a hat or a sweatshirt or something, right? So, we're certainly trying to keep pricing reasonable and all that kind of stuff and fair, and yet it's become a revenue source for us. It's not totally balancing us out in April or
Right.
May, but it's certainly helping.
It's interesting to hear you talk about adapting. One thing we'll also share is there's part of it is how you're able to have conversations and in a time of uncertainty or selling programs, what you want to do when there's a lot of questions out there. So one of the things is if you're not proactive, if you're not out there having those conversations, if you're waiting, I think one of the speakers that this guy Charlie Hawk, who's a communications expert, who is featured in our Slack group, if anyone wants to have a chance to connect with him. When he works with Fortune 500 companies, one of the things he likes to say is, bad news is not like wine. It doesn't age well, right? So if you're not proactive about what's going on, you're going to be behind the eight ball. Rachael, pulling you in, I want to talk about virtual training, and then I want to talk about return to play. You all, I think, have done a lot of work in virtual training. As you mentioned, you came for 10 days and the world changed. And I'm curious to know, how do you feel about, what have you learned about virtual training as something that can not only engage kind of the audience and be valuable in the short term, but what have you learned about it in the long run that might factor into the way that you might view the PLL Academy even in normal times?
Yeah, I think we've had a lot of learnings early on. I think certainly in-person coaching is a different skill set than virtual coaching. That you can't sort of go up to a kid and physically sort of show them through a computer screen always. So, working with our players to develop that different skill set. We have our virtual training set up to be all interactive, and that was intentional. They're not pre-recorded trainings because I think that feedback is really important, and it's been an important sort of choice we made when we decided to launch this. And much of what a lot of the other panelists have said, I think we have, multiple paths here where, because of the uncertainty, certainly we'd love to get our in-person events turned on as soon as possible, but obviously safety is first. So we've done a lot of work, spent a lot of hours contingency planning and thinking through, our virtual offerings, and are really just getting started there and have some good stuff coming down the pike. But it's been fun. And I think, kids, my kindergartners are on Zooms, twice a week. So kids have adapted very quickly to that method of teaching and learning. So I think for them, it's probably been more seamless than we could have even, anticipated.
Do you, when you think about, this question of returning to the field and getting beyond virtual training, what are you who's the PLL looking to for guidelines there? I know you're obviously thinking about this at the professional league level as well, but what's the sources of information? How do you make decisions? Because, it is such a fragmented world out there in terms of youth and local sports.
Absolutely. So, luckily being part of the PLL, I actually serve, because of my healthcare background, I serve on our medical COVID committee, which is comprised of a couple of our senior leadership team. And then we have multiple physicians with specialties in different areas, infection control, orthopedics, all those sort of key parts to getting back to lacrosse. So obviously leaning heavily on their expertise around safety, certainly, because we're able to kind of dig into them with the uniqueness of our sport, the level of contact needed, and because we're not in one specific area, we have to consider, the entire country when we're thinking about returning with our different products. So leaning on them first, but also looking obviously at state and local guidelines, for, the different phases, of returning, social distancing, and how can we pivot our products so that people can do that safely and still engage with us.
Steve, you mentioned, some of the other conversations you're having. One of the things that's been interesting that I've seen other sports as well is groups of organizations are getting together saying, okay, there may be some guidance from a national governing body, but it really is a little bit all over the map. So they're really coming together to figure out what there might be doing as a community of organizations. What are some of the ways that people are trying to coordinate this idea of return to play?
Yeah, so U.S. Lacrosse has actually organized a coalition on this very thing, as they should be, sort of, helping kind of pioneer this for our sport specifically. And I'm a part of that coalition. That is, currently they're asking for feedback from everybody that's part of that. They're taking information from the Aspen Institute and other medical organizations, the CDC and whatnot, and trying to I've seen some questions come through on on the board here about, well, what are the restrictions going to be? And I mean, the answer is that's to be determined, and that's going to be county by county and state by state. But they're helping come up, with, for our sport, what does that look like? In varying degrees. And how do tournament operators and clubs, implement those things specifically in our sport. And yeah, I mean, it could be as extreme, who knows, as players only, which would be interesting, right? No fans, no parents, just staff, refs, and coaches and players. I'm not saying that's what it's going to be, but that's a possibility. So it's U.S. Lacrosse is doing a pretty good job there. I think they're pushing the pace. I've encouraged them to push the pace on that, and it seems like they're doing that. And I'm a part of a coalition here in San Diego called Game On San Diego that's figuring out how to bring sports specifically in San Diego County, back onto the field, which I think is going to be applicable more or less, elsewhere too. But learning a lot, taking it all in.
Are you anticipating already or planning for a modified idea of tournament play? Like, do you think that the people traveling as much, how do you knowing that the guidelines are fluid and continue to adjust? I think the CDC may be coming out with youth sports guidelines this week, but all that stuff may shift. How do you plan for that? Yeah,
carefully. I think, I guess, we've thought about all different possible scenarios. It could run the gamut. Like I said, from, we're making our own safety and health and safety protocols that have different tiers. I think the days of handshake lines are over, for the time being, shared water bottles, shared water coolers and things like that. Anything that kind of promotes, gathering is probably a thing of the past for a while. While at the events, talk about things like having player, fan zone where they're, like at the grocery store, the sideline is marked and, only, family members from the same household can be in those boxes. I mean, everybody would be encouraged to wear masks, but we're trying to navigate what can be required, what needs to be, what should be in the encouraged category. Because obviously there's a very lively political debate, right, about civil liberties and things like that, we don't want to be necessarily in the middle of, but, we certainly want to create a safe environment for everybody, or we're not, getting back on the field. So it's it's a multi-layered, complicated kind of thing, right? But, I think we're right. I saw somebody post on social media, I can't remember who it was now, but, these clear masks, that for boys that they would put, shields inside of the mask, the helmet. I mean, geez, is there a world where those become required for a while? I don't know. Right. I don't think so, but who knows at this moment.
Theresa, when you think about, one of the questions here becomes what parents are willing to do. And are you already thinking about adapting the way you're teaching lacrosse, what those experiences would look like? I know you mentioned this idea of goodwill is good and connection doesn't cost anything. And there's a lot of ways you can deliver that value virtually. But how are you thinking about actually returning to the field? And what are there modified forms of lacrosse that you're thinking about as part of that? Or do you feel like when you go back, you're going back?
Well, if you think about who our first coaches are as kids, they're our parents. So I really think that, something that I think has been on my mind for years is just that the parent experience in youth sports is pretty inadvertent. And then it causes a lot of trouble sometimes when they're not having a great experience, sort of trickles down to the kids. And then, we have all kinds of issues. But I think that this can be a time where we are a little more intentional around involving them. And, I think that is a little bit about unofficially or informally teaching them to coach. And it's, a lot of parents have played the sport, and for those who have or have not, just spending some time on just giving them a few tools and some language around what they can do with their daughter and maybe a friend or two. I think we have to be really careful what we do officially or, what we sponsor, just because there is no coverage for us sticking a coach out there right now, and the liability issues around, kids getting sick or our coaches and employees having something happen. But if parents can sort of be a part of that. And we're, again, just like through kind of, like a goodwill thing, just offering support, for them, just, in their parenting. Something that I thought was easy to do in the last couple months is just every few weeks a parent virtual happy hour. I know everybody's now probably scheduled with a happy hour every night of the week on Zoom, and it's getting their fatigue. But to be honest, I think the parents miss each other too, especially when you're in these team environments. And so it was just because, we just like hung out for a little while. And then I was able to say, what we're thinking about these days with the board and, our next steps. But a lot of times it's like, we got to wait another month, or this is how I think things will happen, or how we will make decisions. But we can only kind of talk to the how, not the what, because so much is out of our control. But I do think just that connection for the parents is something that we ramped up. And I think that has made a difference, and something that I can continue when we get back to normal, whether that's in 2 months or 2 years.
There's so many profound things that you said that I loved. And one of the things, in fact, I'm sure if you know Rohit or Roy on our team, leads a lot of our cross partnerships. He gives me a hard time every time I tell this story, but I'm going to tell it anyway, because it's interesting in youth sports where the parents are the customers, and the customer's always right, but no one would ever say that about a youth sports parent, right? Like you have this dynamic where we would never think to say that. And at the same time, like how do you engage them? And one of the things I had a great interview a while back I did with David Robinson, the famous basketball player, one of our investors. And David had this great insight where his son was playing basketball in San Antonio, and he didn't love the team that he was part of. And so he decided to create a new kind of basketball program. And it wasn't going to have the best athletes in it, but he wanted to create it in a new kind of way. And a couple of things were important to him. The first is they hired a coach. And the first thing he said is every parent needs a role. And if you don't define your parent's role, they will define it for themselves, right? Which might mean that they define themselves as the coach, right? They can define themselves as the CEO of your organization. So the first thing he said is we're going to have roles, and we're going to hire a coach. And if I'm David Robinson, I'm not telling the coach what to do. You can't tell the coach what to do because I'm one of the 50 best basketball players of all time. The second thing is that the role that every parent's going to have in the organization is two things. One, it was faith-based. So everyone would pray with the kids after the game. And the second is that every parent in the organization was assigned 2 other kids to mentor over the course of the season. And it was profound, he said, because everyone began to see the experience, not through the eyes of their own child, but through the eyes of other children. So when you're talking about playing time and everything else, you started to view that differently. And the second thing is that the mentoring became really powerful because you built this community around the organization. So what ended up happening? First, that team, which didn't have all the best players, ended up winning majority of the tournaments in Texas and San Antonio that year because the coach was able to coach, the parents fell involved, and there was a real sense of community that they built. The second thing is the mentoring had a profound life effect on the kids in those programs. David happened to work with a couple of these kids that were the first kids in their family to go to college, one of whom ended up going to the Naval Academy, which is no surprise because that's where he went. So I think this idea that and I think I heard this advice last week that made sense to me, which is if you're trying to design how you're coming back to play, if you're not co-creating that with your parents, you're missing a huge opportunity. First of all, is if you design that with them and they're part of that process, they're a lot less likely to challenge you or ask for refunds or whatever it may be on their own because they're devising the solution. The second thing is, to your point, Theresa, I think you're ultimately improving the parent experience where they're fundamentally stakeholders in what you do, right? Even as we can dream of a world in which maybe the parents don't show up at the tournaments that Steve's running and it's just the kids, and imagining what that would look like in terms of the lack of pressure. So a lot of good things to share. Jake, a big part of this is how do you convince parents to come back and sign up for your programs in a world in which there's uncertainty if they're going to be played and not played, and as well as you're dealing with this liability question at the same time. So how are you navigating that as kind of an issue?
Well, I think in our business, the number one most important thing for us is retention, okay? Because if you don't have retention, you're going to struggle to stay in business. So, again, navigating around, hey, are we going to have a season, not have a season? All right. I try to go above that conversation, and it's more along the lines of, hey, do you value the relationship we have? All right. And do you still want to be part of True? All right. And whether that's virtual training, whether that's, private one-on-one training because we can't do practices. But I think, if you have a really good relationship with your families and you have a really good relationship with your kids, and you've done everything you can to make sure they're all right, they're doing good, and you're checking up on them, you're calling them, reaching out to them. I think they're going to do whatever they can to make sure that your program stays afloat and stays in business. That's just my perspective. So.
Yeah, you're working across so many different states. How are you dealing with, especially the states that are already opening up? Are you already starting to run practices or tryouts? Are you modifying the way you're doing that? Do you feel pressure from parents to open, or finding pressure for parents to not do anything until things are a little bit clearer?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. Like in Idaho, our teams already can start practicing. Okay, in Chicago, our teams can't practice at all. All right, so it's a different dynamic now. And the way we've opened up, our teams practicing in Idaho is that, hey, we have a set of guidelines that we've sent out to all of our families. All right, we are not doing a lot of contact stuff right now. We're doing just a lot of small group stick work stuff. We hold practices with no more than 9 players and 1 coach, so we don't go over the 10 mark. Okay, and if we do have more than 20, 10 kids on a field, they're separated, 20, 30 yards apart. All right, in different groups, so they're focusing on doing their stuff. So not a lot of contact stuff, small group training. All right, and really just focusing on stick work. And obviously, hopefully every state will get to that level where they can start doing things like that. But it's.
And how are you navigating the liability question? Do you have updated waivers that you're providing? Is there insurance you're providing? Like, what's your level of comfort around liability concerns here?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, it all depends. A lot of clubs just use U.S. Lacrosse as their insurance provider. For us, we don't only use U.S. Lacrosse, but we have, over an umbrella over the whole company through Gallagher Insurance. So we have multiple different insurance outlets that are helping cover the True Lacrosse program. But we are going to provide liability forms. Okay. That's, to make sure that, hey, if you're going to come out and practice and do small group training, like, you feel comfortable doing it, because we don't want to be liable if something terribly does happen. So.
Rachael, you bring such an interesting perspective here, not only in the context of the PLL, but as you mentioned, your nursing kind of background and healthcare background and nursing home background. When you think about the kind of play that you're thinking about, as we go beyond virtual, do you see a world in which it's modified? How do you think the game of lacrosse should adapt and might adapt, and how are you thinking about it at the PLL?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think certainly lacrosse, when you look at lacrosse, it sort of falls when, like, the Olympic committee is designating high contact sports. Lacrosse is kind of in the middle there, I think. So no one sort of told us who we are, but we're thinking of, when I think of lacrosse, I think of high contact, both on the boys and girls side. So much to what Jake said, as we sort of phase back a sense of normalcy, it'll be, a lower contact version of the sport initially, until everybody, I think there's the confidence in the organizations, but certainly, I'm a parent myself, and thinking about, we want these parents to be comfortable letting their kids take the field again, and understand the measures that are taken. So I think, will there be an altered version, for some interim period? I think that's, very possible.
Yeah. Do you, in one of the things, it seems that it's, as you're trying to kind of reassure parents, what is the messaging that you think about? Like, what is the way, you're asking parents to sign up or be part of something in which there's no certainty about what might happen, and whether there's recurrences, whether everything was normal, whether school's happening in the fall. How do you think about designing and selling, quote unquote, selling your programs, getting people to sign up for programs in an environment like of such uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, the other panelists hit on it. It's trust and communication. So I think the parents need to understand the plan and participate in it if appropriate. Obviously, we're not keeping kids for long periods of time, because they generally come to 1 or 2 events. So it's a different length of the relationship, but I think it's communicating far in advance. This is what we're going to do to keep your kids safe and keep our staff safe, so that people can interact and ask questions around it. I think letting people sort of, things are changing so quickly. So there's a lot of information processing every day, as we're just sort of getting so much data thrown at us, and so many news outlets, giving stories that don't seem like they're all aligning. So it's giving them time and space to process the information so that they can feel comfortable and make that choice. And certainly just from a logistical standpoint, we're not going to hold on to anybody's money that doesn't feel safe. So knowing that, listen, if they decide this isn't for me based on data they're seeing or the plan that we have, we want them to feel comfortable that like it's a personal choice. We'll absolutely work with you to get your money back.
Yeah, it's interesting. One strategy I heard some organizations approaching is to say they figure out what their fixed costs are to keep people employed. And they say, okay, there's an upfront payment that we're going to use to cover that. And the rest is a payment plan in which you're going to pay as those programs happen. And if the programs aren't happening and we cancel them, you're not on the hook for that. So we're partnering together to make sure the organization stays afloat. And then the variable costs that occur with respect to the programming continue to happen. If we're not going to incur the costs, you're not going to take that at risk. And it's a way of managing that if you're getting people to re-sign up for a new season. So I thought that was a pretty interesting strategy. Steve, recruiting is a lot of the tournament play is part of that. And a lot of people wonder, what about summer tournaments and how that ties to recruiting? And also even some of the developments that are happening on the college side, whether it's questions around if there's budgets for them to travel or questions around, the amount of scholarships that might be available. What is your sense about how recruiting is going to happen in this environment, and what role does the tournaments play in that? I remember, I think I heard some news about the IWLCA really saying, hey, you're not going to be part of those tournaments. So what does that look like? What does recruiting look like this summer?
I think, it somewhat remains to be seen. I think, the coaches, gosh, college coaches are jonesing for some lacrosse as much as anybody right now. A lot of these guys rely on, coming out to work showcases and things like that for income, a lot of assistants, and at varying levels, rely on it and they all want to do it. But, obviously they only want to do it safely, and some are having to travel less because of budget restrictions. So I think we're going to see a little bit of everything. I mean, we're working with our video partner, that is going to offer kind of free, and very dynamic, like a video available video content, I should say, to every college coach in the country. And that's something, we're promoting to all our partners, that, even if the coach isn't there, he's very much watching, with the roster right next to the, the game. Normally coaches might go at this, from more of a player profile perspective and go in and I'm going to look at this kid and see his film. Well, now they can start looking at it a little bit more from an event perspective, like, oh, I can't make this particular adrenaline event, but I can go to this video platform, find the kid, in which games he's playing in at that tournament and watch him, from home. And we'll be able to know who logged in, who watched, and be able to, kind of understand. I mean, I think that's part of the interesting part of this new future, this new world we're going to be living in. I mean, that's probably something that's going to be here to stay. Like life on Zoom. I mean, shoot, my parents are 70 and they're like Zoom experts now, which I would, if you told me that 3 months ago, I would have said,
are they doing those virtual backgrounds yet? With you like pictures of you as a kid behind them?
It's unbelievable. So I don't know, like that's just one example of, I think, how, the recruiting windows, are those going to change? If they lose June, are they going to get access to August? Normally there's a dead period in August. On the, the boys and girls dead periods vary, but, is that going to change? And I've asked, some of the top D1 college coaches and they still don't know yet. Their answer is, we'll let you know when we know, kind of thing. So they're in a similar boat. And again, we're communicating as much as we can with them. They want to get back out there more than anything. I think, I feel, for the kids, as much as anything that, need these opportunities to get noticed and seen. And we feel a responsibility, to help bridge that gap for clubs and for kids and for players.
One of the points I'd emphasize as an advice that I see is some of these trends were already happening. The role that technology and data were going to play was a trend that existed before. It's just accelerated. And to your point, right now we're in the new, and at some point we'll be in a new normal in terms of what that looks like. And if you're thinking about things solely in the context of COVID, which it seems like none of you all are, which is one of the patterns that I think is probably going to define the organizations that are most successful out of it, is if you make changes purely for the COVID period, you're missing an opportunity and it's way too narrow. If you're thinking about what you're learning in the COVID period that transforms how you're driving value and what you're doing, whether it's the digital tools that are supporting the recruiting or the ways that you're establishing value or connectivity and goodwill, as you were saying, Theresa, or virtual training in Rachel's case, like if you understand those things as broader ideas, then you can execute them better in the short term because you're making longer term investments in those approaches as opposed to temporal ones. And I think
the
that's
other thing that's stemmed out of this while you're sort of on that topic is that, God forbid, and it came up because people said, well, what if I had to drop my kid off? Can I watch the game? So we're also talking to our video partner about live streaming, and the infrastructure that's involved there. It's an investment because normally they're only filming like the high school games, but now they'd be filming youth and middle school too. And plus there's just a broadcast, live stream broadcast investment that needs to be made at each time they do it. But, that's a real possibility too. I mean, parents dropping kids off, I mean, who knows, but watching the game from the car, on their phone or from the hotel or from home or whatever it is. So that's going to be interesting too. And probably part of our new normal regardless.
Theresa, final question for you, because I don't want to lose sight of this, is how you think about access and environment as we enter this COVID period, but you also have a backdrop of larger economic disruption. And obviously, 30 million people now that have lost jobs. Disproportionately, those in underserved communities are going to be impacted. How do you think about that in the context of lacrosse, in the context of your work, in the context of how, as lacrosse thinks about navigating this return to play and whatever else, how you figure out that certain families aren't further left behind and have access to the kind of great experiences that all these organizations are offering?
I think kind of what Steve was saying, the things about film and streaming, I think a lot of event directors or film companies have even been trying to push us that direction. Other sports have been doing it for a long time. Other sports have been ranking players and prospects. They've been taking stats at every level. And at our level, the best players, the best prospects are not on all of those recruiting services. The best players are getting seen in person. You're rewarded for going to 8 camps, and you're rewarded if you drop the money to go to a lot of different things. So I think the threshold for watching film, people will be more open to doing that. I think they were kind of moving that direction. College coaches, because of their budgets, low budgets, and not being able to get to places in person. But the kids are now becoming their own videographers and editors. And so the content that they're producing is better. So like when we go back to being able to see kids in person, if there's also a really, really good option for seeing something over like a streaming, I know Adrenaline has streamed some of their all-star events, on TV. I think Rachael's commentated some of them, I think if a lot of the events are providing that, I think there's a lot of benefit, and the in-person stuff won't go away either, but I think it closes the gap for the girls from the non-traditional areas, or for the young players from non-traditional areas who are at a huge disadvantage because we can't fly to 8 tournaments this summer. So, we have great balance with, our schedule. Our kids aren't getting overuse injuries because we're not at so many tournaments. But we do risk, if a coach is watching a kid for 30 minutes, one half of one game, because there's 200 teams at a tournament, it's really up to a lot of luck. So I think it'll really help close that gap for kids from non-traditional areas.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see the upside of that innovation. So I just shared, Baller TV is an interesting organization that does a lot of streaming. We're part of a digital innovation panel we did. Some interesting takeaways there. But even as you talked about kind of kids and, it's not only a question from the college perspective, it's also a question that kids are going to have a greater voice in youth sports moving forward. And they're digital natives. If you think about esports and video games, the whole concept of esports is youth sports combined with video games. It's video games in the context of leagues and tournaments and events. The kids are running it and the parents haven't figured out what's going on. So it's this cool experience that they're all part of. And I think the more that youth sports borrows from that is the more that they'll create opportunities for engagement. It's been awesome to have this discussion, because I think as much as there's this immediate crisis that we're responding to, and I think as Steve kind of and Jake spoke about, you don't know. So all you can do is step back and drive more value. And whether that's the virtual training that PLL is doing, or whether that's Theresa's kind of admonition around, connection doesn't cost anything, and doubling down in the way that you're delivering those and building those kinds of relationships. If you use this opportunity that everyone's facing to reinforce what your organization stands for and to innovate, you'll not only get through the crisis, but more importantly, you'll be stronger for it. Because to be sure, there's a lot of organizations that aren't going to adapt, aren't going to figure that out, and you'll be the options that are available. So I just want to thank each of you for providing such great insight for this community, and then as important for the incredible work that you're doing in your communities as we're trying to kind of bring sports back. And this is going to be the greatest sports comeback ever. If you think about what establishes something like normalcy, it'll be driving around, seeing people playing on fields. Will be the time we know that we got past this crazy period of time that we'll be telling our kids and grandkids about. So to know that you all are helping drive that and lead that is something that we certainly appreciate. So thank you all for being here. Thank you all for joining and engaging in today's conversation. Check out our industry Slack group. We'll post a link to that afterwards. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find sports organizations from across the country and across different sports to continue this with. And if there's questions we didn't get to, let us know, and we'll hit up the panel as well. So this is Jeremy Goldberg and LeagueApps signing off from this NextUp Town Hall. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.